right. Good morning. We'll get started. I'm Dreama Gentry here at Berea College, Partners for Education. Thanks for joining us in our first 2021 Rural College Access and Success conversation. It's good to be back with you guys. It's good to be in 2021. I can't believe it's only the second week of 2021. It feels like we're already a month or so in, but it's great to be with you all this morning. I'm excited about the topic today and our guest. We're going to talk about early college high schools, which we know is a proven practice for accelerating outcomes for young people. And it's something that's been, that works in rural places. And I think it's something we need to see more of. So I'm going to invite Joseph Goins to join me this morning. I've known Joseph since, Lord, for several years. He's also a Berea College graduate, so we've known each other for years. And so it's great to welcome Joseph with us here today.
Thank you very much. Exciting to be here. And as Dreama said, we met at Berea College. It's when I had very long hair, but exciting times and excited to talk about this topic. It's something we've been focused on for a while. So excited to be here, Dreama.
Yeah, you had the long hair and I had the big 80s hair. So I'm not going to give away our ages, but we both had a lot different hair back then.
I may have even colored my hair once upon a time.
I think it's going to be about time to color it again, too.
Yes, absolutely. For different reasons.
For different reasons. So Joseph, why don't you share with us the work you're doing now and how you got engaged in thinking about early college high schools at this national level?
Sure. And just as a quick background, I've been in education for 31 years, worked in almost every state in the country, and started out as a high school math teacher. But I got my doctorate at Vanderbilt in leadership and policy about 7 years ago. And through that work, we really studied effective policy, what works in schools. And so I started my own research company about 6 years ago. We focus on research, policy, and practice. And early college high school is one of the signature kind of areas we focus on. And right now we're supporting 2 states in that work, New Mexico and Massachusetts. And in both cases, we work with the principals, we work with the schools, we work with the design principals. You know, what I've come to appreciate over the model over the last several years is just how effective it actually is and the impact it has on students. And so as Dreama said at the beginning, it's a proven model. And I've got both qualitative and quantitative data to share, but it definitely works, and to see the outcomes is quite impressive.
Yeah, and I was real interested in having you join us because I know as folks are thinking about this next year, and especially those of us that are doing Gear Up programs, we're thinking about designing Gear Up programs and designing interventions and programs, and we're always looking for the research base and what works. And what I found looking at early college is that some of the things from early college, even if you can't step fully in and do the model, there's still some pieces of that really could accelerate Gear Up programs. So I think I'll turn it over to you, Joseph. You've got some slides to share. If folks have questions for Joseph during the presentation, drop those in the chat or the Q&A. After the presentation, Joseph and I'll have a chance to talk and answer those questions. We also will be providing the slide deck to everybody when we send out the link to this. So you'll get the slide deck and the content information. And Joseph, I'm seeing your slide with the big check mark. So okay. That's where you are. And so I will turn it over to you. I don't know if that's where you want to be or not, but, yes. But I'll turn it over to you now.
Okay. And as we go through this, I'll keep the chat open on my screen too. I broke this up into just 3 quick segments. And the first part was, I always call it the why. So what's our story? You know, so why did early college high schools kind of pop up as this policy reform effort? And we're going to go from the why to the research to why it works. And then we're going to look at actually what the policy says and what it does within the components. And so, again, as I go through this, Dreama, you interrupt me or somebody post something in the chat and I'll be glad to answer some questions, okay?
That sounds great.
And just to clarify, you should see a screen that says, "What's the story?"
Yep,
Right?
we're on the right page, so we're good.
Okay. So the early college high school movement really started with the Gates Foundation and Jobs for the Future, JFF. And they really came together, and it was over a lot of issues. And a lot of them deal with what I call the 3 E's that we'll talk about here in a second. But they really wanted to look at what's going on in higher ed. And part of it was we have this gap on marginalized students that are not getting access. We know what the job market's doing, and then we have this massive student loan debt that's looming. And so when they brought the policy people together, they really said, well, how do we think about some of these issues that are impacting us? And as you guys well know, this student loan debt, I think, is approaching $2 trillion this year. So it's quite substantial. And what that starts to look like, and again, we're just looking at why first. I call this the 3 E's: education, employment, and economic development. And part of what we look at and what the early college model does is it looks at all 3 of these. It looks at how do we look at our education, how do we respond to our local community, the employment needs, and provide economic development. And these are 3 slides I've used in lots of presentations, are these 3 stats. But nationwide, I believe right now it's about a 57% college completion rate in 6 years. We've got a problem, and the first problem is 43% of all college graduates are classified as underemployed. And what that means is there's a gap in their ability to get a job in what they majored in. And that impacts that student loan problem. And then you've got the economic development issue with employers saying they can't find the skills. Again, this was something from JFF to where they were trying to get at this mismatch. I always say, what's it look like in real terms? Simply speaking, 89% of high school teachers thought they had kids ready for college. 26% of college faculty said they were ready. 96% of all college people said they were ready for the job market on 11% of the businesses. So you have this mismatch between your 3 E's, and what early college does is try to connect this pathway, right? And again, it focuses on relevancy. And I'll provide these slides, and I have some notes where all these resources are from if anybody would like to use them. But you have this students not feeling engaged issue, and we start to lose them as they progress up through high school. And so, and the 2 economic things I'll share, this is what we know is the majority of jobs that are classified as high wage and high growth are going to require some type of post-secondary degree. And so that is a big issue. 20 years ago, it was the opposite. And what we know where the equity becomes a very big issue is, and I always say this is just one of the biggest equity issues you can look at. Less than 10% of children born in the bottom quartile earn a degree, which means they don't have access to those high wage jobs. And so you've got this issue with all of these intersecting points, right? And we know, again, this was from Bob Wise, talking about that we know that majority of high paying jobs are going to require post-secondary education. And the early college is an example of, and what I've learned to appreciate about it is deeper learning and best practice. I like what you said at the beginning of this stream, of that some of these are just generally best practices that can transform schools to begin with. The model in itself, when you put it together, is a holistic model, but there are absolutely, it's embedded in the best practices of what schools should do from creating supportive systems. Let's jump into the idea of do they work? And I'm going to go through some of this fast just so I can save time for questions. But if I'm going too fast or too slow, Dreama, you put your hand up. I can see you on the camera. But if anybody else has questions, let me know. So there is a lot of research looking at the difference between dual credit and early college. And by the way, both dual credit and early college typically has very good research. But in early college, what the goal with an early college initially was, going back to Gates and JFF, was we're going to focus only on first generation, and we're going to focus on marginalized learners that don't have access. Dual credit has a tendency to be available to everybody. Early college sets a purpose, and that purpose is first generation. We're going to focus on those low income students, and we're going to try to close this gap. And so that is one of the first design principles that sets out, that says we're going to start with those students, and then we're going to create a cohesive model that integrates high school and college work. Now, the difference is you're not necessarily doing this college work as individuals. The whole school is participating in this, and we'll go through that. So some of the findings, and by the way, these findings were from JFF and Gates. There's a question there, and I'm going to save that to the end if that's okay, Dreama. But it's a good question, Samantha. We'll get to that. So the first research was looking at the Gates Foundation and JFF. And again, you see what I've highlighted in red is who were these students. And what I want you to see is 93% of these students graduated high school versus 78% of the traditional students. So again, remember, we're targeting the population that would historically drop out at a much higher rate, and now they're averaging 93% graduation. 30% of those high school students were actually graduating with an associate degree in this original study, which is, I've got some funny stories where I've gone to graduations and the students are actually graduating with their associate degree before they get their high school diploma, which is kind of ironic and kind of funny to see that you've got students, because community colleges and some of these colleges actually close out earlier. So and the other stat that is just amazing, 78% of these students go directly into college to complete. So again, the data nationwide is very good. Early college high school students on average are earning 21 credits. And so I'm pausing, Heather, to read your comment. Yeah, you're probably right. That is a good comment. And again, I think one of the things I'll say about early college, and at least the model, everything about an early college high school is set out to be intentional. It's intentional, and it's the design on the population it focuses on, which means you have a recruitment process on getting students into the model. But it's also intentional on the supports it provides. And we'll talk about that in just a second, right?
And Joseph, I will say that most of the comments are coming just to the panelists. So
Okay.
if folks want everyone to be able to see their comments and questions, just make sure that as you're doing it, you say everyone.
Okay.
And that way everybody can see it. And I think the comment Joseph was referring to was a comment around early college and dual credit.
Yes. And again, what makes it special, and it's funny because in some of these states they'll create designation criteria. So to be in early college high school, you've got to meet the criteria. And criteria number one is we're going to focus on equity. And I've gone to schools that were doing great work, but they were not hitting the equity attainment goal, right? And again, that's why I said some of these things transferred just good practice, but an early college model says we're going to be intentional in our effort. And again, you'll see things like this. Minority students from low income families were 10 times more likely to obtain a college degree. And that's what the research, and one of the reasons why I think you see such an impetus on early college is the research is so good on this population. I've got a couple more studies here I'm going to show. The first one was, this was another ARR study done in North Carolina. Do early college students have better outcomes than other high school students? And what is their family background? And so again, we've looked at this a little bit. 81% of the students from North Carolina enrolled in college. Early college students were significantly more likely to earn a college degree than comparison students. And the study from North Carolina was a 6-year study. It involved 1,800 students. And it was actually listed in the What Works Clearinghouse. The study is called Smoothing the Transition to Post-Secondary, the Impact of Early College. This is a tier 1 study. This is an RCT study. They had a control group. Probably one of the best research studies I've read in a long time. Just completed September of 2019. But I put some of the findings up on the screen just to give you an example. The percent that enroll in college versus business as usual was plus 17. Degree attainment was plus 26, and college credit hours was plus 37. Those are big, big numbers when you're looking at a study like this. And so, again, some really good data on what the impact was. They went back and they also started doing an economic output, and I believe AIR calculated for every dollar spent in policy for an early college high school student, it was 15 to 1. And David asked a really good question. Are you experiencing any kickback from two-year institutions that house these programs for the FTE credit? And David, that's probably the biggest hurdle issue. So the answer is yes to David's question. And I think it's a policy question that has to be discussed because who pays for those credits? And in the states that I've worked in, both in Massachusetts and in New Mexico, there is funding set aside specifically for these programs. And I think your question is very important, and I'm going to get into one of the design principles right here, because without it, you probably are going to have the biggest kickback from your higher ed institution. So the policy, again, looks at what I call effective schools. They base the model in effective schools. We're going to focus on a small population. We're going to look at the culture. We're going to build partnerships. We're going to create a vision for learning. And what that starts to look like is most early college high schools, and they can be standalone or they can be small learning communities within a comprehensive high school. If anybody's here from Texas, there are a lot of comprehensive high schools that have early college high school communities within them, right? Yeah, it's a good question, Kathy. Good question. She loves the success and the stats. Are we cheating low-income students out of 2 years of college? And I think that's a good question. I don't know if I know the answer to that. I think what I've seen is a lot of students go on to get their 4-year, but they are accelerating. In some states, I'm going to highlight Massachusetts for a minute. One of their goals in the early college program is every student gets 12 credits, which means they're getting about a semester out of the way. And the reason is, again, going back to some research says that if we can get a student to have that college experience and to understand that college exposure, then we're much more likely to see them successful. And so I think part of the goal is to close that exposure, that experience gap, even if it's only 12 credits. And so, we talked about 30 credits, but I've seen really effective programs that are just focusing on 12, right? Um, it's Craig, I hear you loud and clear. Craig posted a question with high schools who don't want to change to offer students advanced opportunity. And when I get into the design principles, I'm going to go through them because you'll understand, Craig. So this is like the conceptual framework. If you want to think about this, we've got the core principles, we've got the early college experience, and then we've got our outcomes that we're looking for. And so I'm going to go through each principle. So like this is an example. Design principle number 1 is equity. And part of that equity is the focus on eliminating barriers for entry. So one of the things that does make this different is by design, there should be no barriers to entry, none, right? And what that means is you're going to deal with students that may have gaps in their learning, and how do we close those gaps and accelerate their opportunities through learning. And so, you know, again, I say there's nothing intentional about the work in an early college model. You know, you're going to focus on eliminating barriers to participation, and then we're going to have open enrollment, tuition free, and that's where that partnership with your higher ed is going to become really, really important. And you're going to scale the program. The second design principle is called academic pathways. And you could think about this, and I've highlighted some areas to think about, but it's really, you've got to be clear and detailed about the academic pathways from secondary to post-secondary, because you really got to think about your sequencing and how does that work? Do we accelerate the high school credits? Do we offer a dual credit Algebra 1, for example? And so those are really intentional efforts, and most programs that do this, they really spend some time thinking about that course description. The next one is design principle number 3. There's 5. So number 1 is equity. Number 2 is focus on your academic pathways and how you're aligning what you do. Number 3 says we're going to do student support. And the difference between this and dual credit, I always say often, is it's the support you're going to provide, right? You've got to provide wraparound support, which means we're going to set aside counseling sessions. We're going to check in with these students. If they're taking college credits, we're going to make sure we understand what they do. I've seen schools set up seminar classes that students report to once a week, especially when they're maybe juniors or seniors, to where they're describing their college experience. And so, and that support, you can think, again, this is where one, I always say, this is one that obviously we should be doing this in general, but it is an intentional effort on early college. Next is a connection to a career. If you remember those 3 E's at the very beginning, early college, high school set out to think about each of those. We're going to focus on first generation marginalized learners, give them an opportunity to get a degree. We're going to reduce the tuition, it'll be tuition free. And then we're going to connect them to different career pathways that are targeted to be high wage, high growth. Does that make sense to everybody? And the last one I'll talk about, and then I'll be quiet, Dreama, and we'll take questions. But the last one is effective partnerships. And this goes back to the question from David that asked to the attendees, kickback from the second year institutions. And I call this effective partnerships. You really need to have an effective higher ed partner that wants to work with you, that wants to design the program, and in a lot of cases, a partner that's from the workforce. So we ask schools to sign memorandum of understanding with their higher ed partner, understanding what they're trying to do. And this is where you get into the policy, the funding, and how that works. So again, to review the 5 principles, you've got equity, you've got academic pathways, you've got student support, connection to a career, and effective partnerships. So I'm going to be quiet for a second and take questions, and Dreama, see what your questions are.
Yeah, that sounds great. And yeah, there you are. I see you again. So one question that I had as you were going through this, I know some states have some legislation around early college high schools. Do you know how many states? And if folks are curious about whether or not their state has that legislation, how would they figure it out?
Yeah, and it would probably be through your dual credit office first because they will be doing the funding through the dual credit model. And so most states have set that up. The states that I'm aware of that are funding this as a policy initiative are states like North Carolina, Texas, New Mexico, and Massachusetts. Those are four I know that are doing it as a policy. And what they do is they actually reimburse the higher ed partner for the credits. So whatever that cost is, the higher ed partner gets the reimbursed for that cost, which makes them want to do the program financially, which sets up that partnership to be much more effective. But I've also seen the states that are doing this, they set up like what I call designation criterias to where they really want to measure because you can be doing this and I've gone into programs, but it's all high income students, right? And you're like, wait, you took money from the state, but that wasn't necessarily the intent of the program. And if you want to do that, I always say that's really good work and they can still do it, but that wasn't the intent, right? If you're in New Mexico and outside of Albuquerque, everything in New Mexico is rural. So we work with the early college programs there, and to see that transformation is pretty big. And Melanie asked a really good question just then, and I have seen lots of private funding, by the way. In New Mexico, the project actually started with a foundation called the Daniels Foundation, and they funded 5 startup programs that have now expanded to 27. So there are private groups that I believe will fund this. I think the initiative checks off a lot of boxes for foundations, and I would encourage your people that are attending to reach out to those groups. And I think they are they could be very effective. Massachusetts has tons of private funding on their early college programs that are just private foundations that set up, right? Um, yes, Melanie, you asked another question. I'm skipping Craig, but Craig, I like your response too. It's interesting because I'll do Craig's question. Craig, he asked that to the panelists, so I need to read that, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, Craig asked the question or posted a comment that they look at a regional approach and they work around career technology pathways. I have seen that too. And there is some dispute in the community, like about like going down the path of like an industry certificate in an early college model. I've seen it to be very effective though. And in some cases, I've seen them rename the program to like innovative pathways, and they'll give it a different name that focuses entirely on industry credentials and that type of model. But I have seen that, Craig, and I've seen it to be an effective model. There is some debate, should we have 2 versions of early college, one that focuses on that college model, and one that focuses on a more technology industry certificate model. And Melanie, go ahead, Dreamer.
Yeah, I was just, and then we'll get to Melanie's comment about the criteria. I think the interesting thing that's coming up to me is that early college high schools could actually be created by the community to meet the workforce needs in their community. I could see it as a state level, but I could also see if you have a community that's really thinking of how do they ensure success even from cradle to career of their students, this could be a great strategy because then it could actually be designed to impact the workforce needs of that rural place and that rural community. So regionalism and local workforce would be critical. Is that things that folks like in New Mexico, do they consider that when they design their early college? Is there community engagement in the design?
Yeah, and in fact, the design principle that's called connection to a career, what it actually asks from the participants is to look at the labor market data and look at those needs. right? And invite those business partners in. And you're exactly right, because I think when you do that, you also have the opportunity to increase local funding and not rely so much on state funding on your program. And I've seen that to be very effective. You know, we've brought in higher ed, the K-12, and the business around this topic, and then it almost becomes self-sustaining. And so it's a very good model. And in selecting your pathways, you're supposed to look at the data and say, well, here's kind of our needs, and here's how far we can reach with those needs. Early college program is not set up to replicate a community college. It's set up to say, we're going to focus on some of those gen ed credits. We're going to try to focus on the pathways that are in need. So for example, you could do a STEM pathway, but your dual credit could be focused all on your science and math, right? That your students earning, but they're also being exposed to all your science, technology, engineering, and math careers at the same time, right? So when they graduate, they get that opportunity to pursue advanced degrees, right? So yeah, that's a good point, and I think that's a very good question.
And that leads me into the question that Melanie had around the criteria used to identify the underserved populations. Is that criteria that you're seeing set at a state level, or is it something at locally? And how are schools, early college, high schools, determining for their purposes who is underserved?
Yeah,
What's the
and it's a
models?
very good question. And Melanie, it's probably the hardest part of the model, I think, for schools to think about. And what I've seen from a policy level at a state, and I've seen this from multiple states, so it must be a national trend, is your early college must model the demographics of your region. So for example, if I have 70% free and reduced lunch, the model says I better have 70% in my student population that are free and reduced in my early college program. Now that is what I've seen at a policy level. And it does get tricky because a lot of times these early college programs are set up as what you would call schools of choice. Students have to choose to go there. And so it does create that recruitment problem or opportunity, depends on how you want to define it. But you have to go recruit those people, right? It's not as simple as just opening the doors and hope they come, because parents or students will have to say, I want to be in that program, right? And so there's a criteria to do that. I do have many examples, Dream, that I can provide to this group. I have recruitment models. I have rubrics I can share on what people do to look at that.
And I think again, it to me speaks about local voice of looking at your local region and who is underserved in your region. So it also gives you some of that flexibility. One of the criticisms that I hear nationally around dual credit is this concern about the rigor of dual credit courses. And especially if you're thinking of dual credit versus AP, there's that long-standing debate, which I'm not going to get into, but is there criticisms of early college around rigor or any other thing that we need to be aware of? Because I think it's always good to hear what the naysayers are saying about the model too. So what would the naysayers say about this model?
Well, again, let's go to the partnership first. So in a lot of cases, what they do to set up the credits, they'll start maybe in 10th grade, earning college credit in the early college model. And that could be done by a faculty that's in your school that has the credentials to teach a dual credit course. But eventually the model moves to where the students go to that college campus, right? And that's why you have to have a highly effective partner. And in most cases, these partners are close. It's not an hour drive. It's close enough that the students are driving to that college. I've got examples to where they're across the street as a good example. We have examples to where the early college is inside an actual college campus. So the rigor question comes in maybe on the high school side. Are we getting, if somebody's qualified to teach a dual credit and they're teaching algebra, but when they move to the higher ed campus, the rigor question should go away because they're actually on that campus. And that's why I also believe the the enhanced student support model needs to be there, because these are still 16, 17-year-old students. They're not college students. We're giving them the exposure, the opportunity, but you still have to wrap around that support when they're on that campus. And the really, really effective models, they set up weekly seminar classes or things like that, because by the time I become a senior, I could only have one class in high school and all my other classes would be in higher ed. So they might not be on your campus. And so what really good programs do is they bring those students back, whether it's through seminar, project-based, work-based experiences, and internships and things like that, back to the high school community. Yeah, so the rigor though, the two biggest pushbacks I see are the rigor and the funding. The funding is the biggest hurdle I see, because higher ed wants to do it as long as somebody's going to write checks for all these students earning these credits. Because the goal with an early college model is to save money on those first generation families, right? So it has to be tuition free. And so your funding's going to come into place probably before the rigor. But once you get going, it turns into the rigor conversation. Those are probably the two biggest challenges.
Yeah, those are the ones that I've heard of too. I think that the other piece of thinking about doing this in extremely rural places, how do you do it and still get them to the college campuses? Because I think that's an essential piece. Is there early college programs that utilize summer or internships or work as an opportunity to build on? So maybe you can't get them to the campus, but have people built in summer things or extra things to build on that?
Yep, that's exactly right. I know lots of schools that'll do a 6-week summer program. We've got a program at New Mexico State University where they can go for 6 weeks and earn part of an engineering credit. But we do have some examples to where they're doing hybrid online, to where they are facilitating a professor from a university or a community college back to that rural school. I do have a lot. And in that case, what they've done is they've set up a facilitator in the classroom, but the class is being taught by the university, right? So we do have models that are utilizing that as a model. And it depends on your pathway. Obviously, some pathways lend it much easier to doing that kind of work, right? If you're doing an industry credential model on, say, welding, then somebody probably physically has to weld something at some point, right? But if you're doing a STEM program that's on computers or IT, there's a lot of work you can do, and all of those are classified as high wage, high growth opportunities. And so we do have lots of models. Taos, New Mexico, which is very rural, they do in fact, I believe their entire higher ed model is online. So because they're so rural, they can't get the students could drive there, but it'd be an hour, right? And I've seen it to where schools will have more than one higher ed partner. And you just want to think through that. I've seen a school say, we're going to get a liberal arts higher ed partner, for example, with Berea. And they're going to do some work with us. Then we're going to work with the community college, maybe on a technical pathway, right? And so I've seen high schools set up 2 partnerships, and that works too, right?
So that's interesting. And I think that the pushback on the virtual, or at least the hybrid, it'll be interesting to see how that pushback is impacted by COVID-19, right? Because we've had to do so much with virtual. So we've learned how virtual can be lousy, but we've also learned how it can be extremely powerful and effective. And so do you anticipate, what do you think the impact of this pandemic and going virtual is going to have on this model?
I think it's going to be, and to your point, Dream, Massachusetts actually had a policy against hybrid online models. And then the pandemic happened. And it's hard to have a state policy that says you're against it when everybody's doing it. So I think states have had to hit pause and say, we cannot say we're against it when everybody's doing it. So they've had to learn very quickly. I have talked to lots of programs, and I do believe we're going to see a big change. And I'll give you an example. I've talked to the Tennessee Board of Regents, which governs 14 community colleges in Tennessee. They've already stated post-pandemic, they will forever do their math online. They have found it to be effective. They found it to be something they can close. So I think you're going to see some program areas that'll say, you know what, we can continue to do this. We can continue to have a bigger outreach and close some of those gaps. And for a large institution to make that kind of decision already, that's pretty big, right? And so I think you're going to see it in certain program areas. They're going to keep doing it because they can have a bigger outreach, and they found it to be effective, right? And I think obviously it's forced the early college programs. I mean, they've had all kinds of policy issues. They've had to deal with policy issues at the high school, and then they've had to go figure out what their higher ed partner is going to do, right? Which is very complicated, right? And so I think during this pandemic, hit through the early college models for a pretty hard loop in their processes. But I do see the pandemic having a change. And, you know, we looked at this. I did a presentation yesterday. We were looking at the economic data. And the greatest problem with the pandemic is the people that it's hurt, right? It's all been low income, low wage people, right? I looked at the data the other day, and if you are in the hospitality, the service industry, it was like negative 48% impact. If you are in a higher earning job, it was like a negative 2%, which is an impact, but it's not a 48% impact, right? And so I think for this population we're talking about, they've been severely impacted by this pandemic. And I think the early college and whatever these programs can do to reach out to these families and these learners will be very important post-pandemic.
And I think there's been several questions around specific examples. And one of the things, Joseph, I think this is a topic that would be great to hear from some practitioners. So we have our Rural Access Summit, I think it's the last week of April. This would be a great topic if you could find a couple of principals or practitioners from perhaps rural places to come in and share just what it looks like in their school, because I think that would help us too.
Yeah, be glad to do that. We have plenty we could choose from. And I think there's a lot that would be more than willing. And we probably even get, you know, we're doing a student video project right now to where we're capturing student voices and not just the administrators. So there's lots of different things I think we could show in practice that would be very demonstrative of the model.
And we did have back to sort of the policy piece, and someone had mentioned that with the Pell Grant expansion, that's covering, I guess, some dual credit. Have any of your early college high schools thought about actualizing and using that, or any thoughts on that?
Yep, we have lots of schools that use the Pell Grant. We have lots of schools that will actually, like if you were in Tennessee, you could use the Hope Scholarship to pay for it. And so all your states, I've seen programs access all of those different opportunities that they could pursue, right? Yes. They'll pull down their Perkins and their Pell Grant money. I've seen them pull down Perkins if they're offering a certain pathway.
Okay. So localities that wanted to do this, or a community that wanted to do it within a state that yet hasn't done state policy, could probably learn from others and pull it together. Because I could even see if you have it in a state and show that it works well, then maybe you can move state policy to actually, you know.
And in almost every case, that's what's happened. North Carolina, they've now got a What Works Clearinghouse study. You've got the Daniels Foundation that funded New Mexico with 5 schools. And you're exactly right. That's what's been done. If anybody wants to think about it, again, even if your state doesn't have it, there's a lot of research and a lot of practices that you don't have to start from zero. There's some really good tools.
Is there any federal discretionary grant programs that you know of that have been used to support at least pieces of this or some of this?
There is in the Higher Ed Act. And it got lost in the pandemic, just like a lot of things. We all got lost. I'm still lost. But in the higher ed bill that was passed in July, they set aside $400 million in federal money specifically named for early college programs. Now that money is supposed to flow to your states in state grants, right? And I don't know how the states are doing that right now, but and I don't even know how that higher ed law, the monies are flowing down. But from a federal level, it's got a lot of attention, and you can understand why. The population, the outcomes, if you can close that gap on that bottom 10%, you not only are going to have a big impact, you're going to have a huge economic impact. And so I think a lot of people I say this all the time, I'm not the only one that looks at this research, other people, and they're making good policy decisions, and they're trying to put funding to encourage people to look at it. I would have to look at each state individually to see how they're rolling that money out. I don't know in the new CARES Act 54 billion for K-12. I don't know if they set aside money for early college. Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if they did, but I haven't gone through it to see.
Yeah, so that's something. And I know there's also the Department of Labor funding to support things like apprenticeships and things, pathways. And so I think you could probably, if you were innovative in a place, pull from multiple funding streams to make this work. And then there was some more interest in the examples of how the Pell Grant expansion's used. And that would be, Joseph, thanks for giving them your email, because that would be a good one. But that would also be something if you pull together practitioners that they could share their best practices.
Yeah. One of the things we did during the pandemic, and Dream and I were talking about this before the call, we normally, when we work, my company, when we work with states or we work with policy people, we actually do convenings and try to bring people together. But we've been doing virtual spotlights to where we've had principals virtually share their model. And I can share those easily with people so you can watch and hear from practitioners. But I love the idea of your convening, Dreama, and bringing people in to actually do a little bit deeper learning on the model and share how they set it up.
So I think I was going back through the questions. I think most of them we covered. Some were asking for the specific examples, which you gave some of those. Any other thoughts that if someone's thinking about how do they use, they can't, it's not possible right away to get this in our school or in our district. What components of it would you suggest they start looking at immediately to impact the kids they are serving?
Well, obviously, I think the higher ed partnership would be one, because you could still offer dual credit. I also think looking at the support model, what are we doing to support students? How are we checking in with these students? Are they just taking a class? And there's some really good effective models I've seen on that. I've seen schools build in service projects embedded within that force them to communicate back. So those are some of the first steps I would take. And what a lot of schools do, you don't have to do the whole thing. They'll start with the 9th grade class, they'll add the 10th grade class, they'll add the 11th grade class, so that maybe in a 3-year period, you've got the full working model, right? And so you could start and you could say, you know what, we think we really want to do this. We've got 50 kids we're going to start with in a 9th grade model. We've got our community ed partner, and you're just going to slowly roll that through. It's really hard to launch it all at one time. It really, truly is. And so what I've seen is a lot of schools, they'll start with a cohort and they'll slowly add. And so you can track that first group all the way through, but then you're adding the groups behind it. And that's typically the way they start, as opposed to saying, we're going to start 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, right? We've got it all figured out right now. And that way you've got time to build the course sequence as you go and what you want. And you probably somewhere in the middle will be adding a second pathway or something like that as it evolves. But that's typically what people see. And there's really good things out there like, and again, I'll share this if anybody wants it, but like there's a blueprint Texas produced that literally is like a nice stuff they should be doing. So there's, again, good resources out there to think about that.
And I think it reminds me, when you've been around for 25 years or so doing this, the smaller learning community movement, right? So I could also see it in our rural, larger schools, having it as a smaller learning community that really becomes an early college high school. So lots of potentials here, lots of possibilities. So Joseph, thanks for joining us today. We'll get your PowerPoint to folks. And if there's a resource page or a one pager that has links that you want us to share, that will be out. We'll email everyone when this is posted with the connection, with the attachments. Let's talk about what's coming up next. So we're getting together in February. And Jay, I think you're my Samantha today because Samantha's out today. So can you post my slides? So next month, February 10th, we'll be joined by Kirsten Yedo and Danielle Vetter. They are with Ascendium Education Partners, and Ascendium has a division of their work now around rural post-secondary ed and workforce training. And so Kirsten and Danielle will be with us to talk about their strategy and what they're seeing as best practices in the field. So I'm excited to talk with them and chat with them. And then April, I think we have a slide also for our summit. So the summit is April 26th through the 30th. This was actually supposed to be in New Hampshire with our friends there at the Campus Compact that also runs the AmeriCorps and the Gear Up programs for the state of New Hampshire. And we decided to go virtual. And I think we made the smart choice with going virtual. So it'll be a Monday through Friday from 1 to 3:30. We'll have a little networking time at the beginning each day. And Jay did just put in, actually it's under Samantha's name, the link if you would like to go ahead and register. Our goal is to really make this equitable and affordable for lots of attendees to attend. So we did change this where an organization will register for a registration fee of $250, but then you have multiple registrations. You can do as many people from your organizations as you want. And so we're really trying to get more people in the room. And I think that's one of the beauties of this pandemic is we've learned how to create more equitable learning opportunities. So there is the link. We'll also be sending that out. So please go ahead and register for the summit if you're interested. Our team will start pushing out the information on the speakers. Each day we'll have a keynote and a breakout. On Thursday, we're actually doing a deep dive, like a 2-hour deep dive into one topic. So we're trying to mix it up and keeping the virtual working for us. So Jay, is that my slides or do I have any more? I think that might be it. So you can, we'll leave the summit one up. Actually, go ahead and take that down. So I can, yeah, there we go. I see Joseph again. I do think that the other thing I want to remind folks of is that we launched a rural library network. And so if you all are working with school librarians or public librarians in your work, check out our website. And Jay, I don't know if you can put a link to the Rural Library Network. We're going to be offering monthly webinars for librarians that focus on the cradle to career piece, because we know that our libraries are key partners in our rural communities. So I think that's everything. And Joseph, thank you for joining us. I was thinking you've agreed to do this. You've put your
No problem.
email in here.
Exciting. And if anybody needs anything, I'll be glad to share. I will send Dreama the PowerPoint and some links. But again, I'll be glad to dive in. We've been doing this now for about 6 years and got a couple of states, and I've worked with a couple of 100 schools on this. So, but be glad to dive into it with anybody that has more questions. Okay. Thank you, Dreama, for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you, everybody. We will leave the chat up for a minute so that if you want to capture that link about the summit. Thanks, everybody. Oh, Jay, can you put the library network link in here? I'm putting you on the spot. Hey, there it is. You're great. Okay, so the link to the library is there. And again, please share that out. It's a free network. We also have uploaded, we did our launch, and I was joined by Mark Shriver, who's with Save the Children US programs, and Jennifer Garner, who's an actor and philanthropist, to launch that. So that was cool. And that is actually uploaded for your libraries to look at too. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. And I'll see you in February.